The house had always been there, crouched at the very end of Miller's Road, where the cracked asphalt gave way to gravel and weeds. Locals avoided it without ever saying why, as though its reputation was etched into the air rather than spoken aloud. To outsiders, it looked like nothing more than an abandoned farmhouse, its windows boarded over, its paint stripped by decades of rain and wind. But for the narrator, someone who had recently moved into town, the house was less of a warning and more of an irresistible pull. Curiosity, after all, is often the sharpest hook. The first time he saw it, dusk was settling across the fields, and the sky burned with a bruised red. The silhouette of the house stood against the horizon, crooked and heavy, as if leaning forward to listen to the approaching night. A chill ran through him, though the air was still warm from the day. The sound of cicadas was constant, yet when he drew closer, they seemed to vanish, replaced by a thick, suffocating quiet. He lingered only a moment before retreating, promising himself it was nothing more than an old building. Still, that night, he dreamt of its hollow windows and the faint sound of something scratching inside. Over the following weeks, the house crept back into his mind like an infection. Whenever he drove past, his eyes darted to it involuntarily. Some days he swore the boards over the windows had shifted. Other days he thought he saw the faintest orange glow inside, like a candle burning too far away to be real. Friends at work dismissed his questions with nervous laughter, insisting it was just some old place, though one coworker muttered that people used to live there but didn't last long. No one would elaborate. That silence only made his curiosity grow sharper. Finally, he decided to go back, this time with purpose. He told himself it was just exploration, a harmless adventure. He packed a flashlight, his phone, and a small pocket knife, more for comfort than defense. Parking his car at the bend of the road, he walked toward the house as nightfall deepened. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes, echoing louder than it should have in the stillness. Each step forward felt like pushing against something invisible, like the very air was thick with warning. His heartbeat quickened, but he pressed on until the rotting porch creaked under his weight. Standing at the threshold, he could smell the dampness of wood and the metallic tang of rust. His flashlight beam cut across the broken doorframe, catching on warped wallpaper and the skeletal remains of furniture inside. For a moment, everything was still, until the silence broke. From somewhere deep inside, faint but deliberate, came the sound of footsteps. They weren't fast, not frantic, just slow, steady, and moving closer. He froze, unable to decide whether to run or to finally step inside. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving only the strained thudding of his heartbeat. He stood frozen in the doorway, his flashlight trembling in his hand, the narrow beam quivering across the warped interior walls. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, yet his body remained locked in place, compelled by the same force that had dragged him here in the first place. He whispered into the dark, "Hello?" The sound brittle and foolish in the heavy silence. There was no reply, but something about the air inside had changed. It felt denser now, almost electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Gathering what little courage he had, he stepped inside. The floor groaned under his weight, releasing a damp, earthy smell that clung to his throat. His light slid across broken frames hanging askew on the walls, family portraits bleached and warped beyond recognition, faces blurred by mold and time. A dining table sat in the center of the room, covered in a tattered cloth, and scattered across it were rusting forks and knives, as though the family had simply stood up mid-meal and never returned. He swallowed hard, his unease sharpening with every detail that suggested abandonment but also interruption. As he moved deeper, the sound returned, not footsteps this time, but a low creak from upstairs, the sound of weight shifting on ancient floorboards. He aimed his flashlight toward the staircase, its railing bent and splintering, leading into a suffocating blackness above. The noise came again, slower this time, as though whoever, or whatever, was up there had realized it was being followed. His breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself forward, telling himself it was probably an animal. The excuse didn't convince even him. Halfway to the stairs, his foot knocked against something on the floor. He stooped and picked it up, a child's toy, a small wooden horse with one wheel broken off. The paint was chipped, but faint red streaks remained along its side, too dark and uneven to be paint. He froze, the air turning colder, as though the house itself were exhaling around him. From the corner of his eye, he thought he saw something at the top of the stairs, a figure, small and hunched, slipping back into the dark. He blinked, his pulse hammering, but the beam of his flashlight revealed only emptiness. Still, he couldn't shake the certainty that something waited for him upstairs. The silence pressed down harder now, as though the house were holding its breath, watching to see what he would do. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and climbed the first step. It moaned under his weight, loud enough to echo through the house. He froze, waiting for a reaction. Somewhere above, the faint sound of breathing answered him, raspy, uneven, and unmistakably human. Each stair groaned beneath his weight, the sound dragging long into the silence like a warning he couldn't ignore. The higher he climbed, the colder the air grew, until it felt like the warmth had been bled from his skin. His flashlight shook in his hand, its beam jittering across the walls, revealing patches of peeling wallpaper that looked like withered skin. The breathing he'd heard above hadn't stopped, it grew steadier, louder, as if whoever was waiting up there wanted him to know he was getting closer. At the top of the stairs, the landing stretched into a narrow hallway lined with 3 doors. The first was ajar, opening into what looked like a bedroom. The second was shut tight, the paint blistering and cracked around the handle. The third door at the far end was wide open, its darkness swallowing the beam of his light as though it refused illumination. The sound of breathing was loudest from that direction, each ragged exhale scraping against his nerves. For a moment, he almost turned back, but something inside him twisted, a gnawing curiosity stronger than fear. He stepped into the first room, the ajar door creaking wide with a gentle push. The bedroom was small, its floor covered in dust so thick his footprints left deep impressions. A bed frame sagged under a moth-eaten mattress, and on the nightstand lay a cracked porcelain doll, its face missing one eye. He swept the light across the walls and froze. Scratched into the paint, shallow but deliberate, were dozens of names, layer after layer, scrawled in uneven handwriting. Some were crossed out. Some were repeated. And among them, faint but unmistakable, was his own. Panic spiked in his chest, and he stumbled back, nearly tripping over the doll. He shone his light wildly across the room, as though expecting someone to be hiding in the corners, watching him. Nothing moved. The air was still, suffocating, but he couldn't unsee the writing. He backed out of the room, his breath shallow, and aimed his light down the hallway again. The second door rattled softly, as though something behind it had shifted. He froze, the sound lasting only a second, then stopping completely. Now only the third room remained, the open one at the end of the hall. The breathing was louder than ever, impossibly close, but his light still couldn't pierce beyond the doorway. His stomach twisted as though something inside him knew crossing that threshold would change everything. Still, with a deep, shaky breath, he forced his legs forward. He took one step, then another. As he neared the doorway, the breathing stopped altogether, replaced by something far worse, the sound of whispering, dozens of voices murmuring all at once, rising like a tide. The whispers seemed to seep into his bones, rattling against his nerves until he could hardly think. He stood frozen before the open third doorway, the blackness inside beckoning with its relentless pull. But something inside him rebelled. He couldn't step through, not yet. Instead, his eyes darted to the second door, the one with the blistered paint and swollen frame. It stood there in silence, as though it too was listening, waiting for him to choose. Against all reason, he turned away from the whispers and reached for its handle. The metal was icy, biting against his skin. He twisted, but the knob refused to turn. It was locked, and yet faintly, so faintly he thought he imagined it, something scraped along the inside, a dragging sound, slow and methodical, like nails across wood. He pressed his ear against the door. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a sudden thud reverberated against it, hard enough to make him stumble back. The house groaned as though it, too, had felt the impact. His flashlight beam shook wildly, catching flakes of peeling paint that drifted down like ash. Heart hammering, he leaned closer again, whispering, "Is someone in there?" The words were barely out before something whispered back. Not a word, not even language, just a rasp, dry and broken, as though air itself had been given a voice. He stumbled away, bile rising in his throat, his instincts screaming for him to run. Yet, in that moment, he noticed something etched deep into the doorframe, scratches, like tally marks carved one over the other. He counted quickly, his breath stuttering. 37. 37 lines gouged into the wood, each desperate and uneven, as if whoever made them hadn't wanted to stop. The whispers behind the third doorway grew louder now, more insistent, as though mocking him for hesitating. They layered over each other in tones both high and low, a chorus of overlapping voices, impossible to separate. The locked door rattled once, violently, before falling still again. He stood in the middle of the landing, caught between two choices: the sealed door that held something desperate and angry behind it, and the open door where voices beckoned him into the dark. Either way, he felt like he had already trespassed too far. Gathering what little nerve remained, he forced himself forward, away from the second door and toward the open one. His body felt heavy, like moving through water, but the whispers pulled at him, dragging his feet step by step. As he reached the doorway, he stopped and raised the flashlight. The beam dissolved almost instantly into the black, swallowed hole. A smell wafted out, sour and rotten, clinging to the back of his throat. And then, just as his hand touched the frame, all the whispers fell silent at once. The silence hit harder than any sound. Something inside that room was waiting, and now, it knew he was there. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. It pressed against him, thick and crushing, as though the entire house were holding its breath. His hand lingered on the splintered doorway, fingers trembling against the wood. For a heartbeat, he considered running, down the stairs, out the door, back to his car, leaving this place behind forever. But the weight of the silence drew him forward instead. Curiosity, or something far darker, pulled him over the threshold. The moment he stepped inside, the air shifted. It was colder here, the kind of cold that sank into bone and marrow, prickling the skin as if touched by unseen hands. His flashlight beam flickered, weak and struggling, but just strong enough to reveal the outlines of the room. The walls were covered in more scratches, this time not words or tally marks, but symbols. Circles, jagged lines, overlapping patterns that made no sense, all etched deep into the plaster as though gouged by something desperate. The floor creaked beneath him, and he realized he was stepping on torn papers scattered across the wood, each covered in handwriting so frantic it was barely legible. At the center of the room stood a small wooden chair, perfectly upright. On it rested another porcelain doll, larger than the one he'd seen before. This one had both of its eyes intact, though they were clouded and glossy, reflecting his trembling flashlight beam. Its head was tilted slightly, watching him with that unblinking stare. Around the chair, the floorboards were stained darker, warped by old water damage, or something else. The smell here was unbearable, sharp and sour, as though the room had been sealed with rot for decades. He knelt to pick up one of the papers. The scrawling words came into focus: "They want names. They won't stop until they have them all." The rest of the writing was jagged and unreadable, but the words repeated over and over, filling the page to its edges. His chest tightened as his eyes flicked back to the doll. Its head now tilted further, ever so slightly, as though it had moved when he looked away. His breath hitched, the flashlight trembling violently. From the far corner of the room came a sound, a slow, deliberate inhale, followed by an even slower exhale, every muscle in his body locked. The sound wasn't the doll. It wasn't his imagination. Something else was in the room with him, crouched just beyond the reach of his failing light. He swung the beam toward the corner, but before it landed, the bulb sputtered once and went out. Darkness swallowed him whole, and the only thing left was that awful sound of breathing, closer now, so close he could feel the air of it brush against his cheek. The darkness pressed against his eyes like cloth, thick and suffocating. He stumbled backward, hands flailing for the doorway. The breathing was so close now he swore he felt damp warmth against his ear. His shoulder slammed into the frame, and at last his fingers found the hallway wall. With a desperate shove, he hurled himself out of the room, nearly falling as his knees buckled beneath him. The door didn't slam shut behind him, but somehow the silence did. The whispers were gone. The breathing had vanished. Only the pounding of his own heart filled the landing that he fumbled for his phone, praying its flashlight would work where the other had failed. The screen's glow burst to life, weak but merciful. He lifted it shakily, the beam trembling as it illuminated the hallway. Nothing moved. The locked second door was still. The ajar bedroom lay open, empty and waiting. The third room, though, was worse. It remained open, yawning black, but something about it had changed. The chair he'd seen inside with the doll, it was closer now. He could see it sitting just beyond the threshold, as though it had been pulled forward while the darkness swallowed the rest. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He staggered against the wall, his eyes darting between the three doors. He couldn't stay here, but every direction felt like a trap. The stairs behind him groaned suddenly, the sound of weight pressing down on them. He snapped the light toward the staircase, but it revealed only the warped railing and shadows stretching too far. His breath came quick and shallow, the air sharp in his lungs, and for the first time he realized the house wasn't just unsettling, it was alive, pulsing, shifting around him like a predator closing its jaws. The phone light flickered. He gripped it tighter, but the screen dimmed again, the battery draining far faster than it should. Panic clawed at him as he pressed his back against the wall. For a heartbeat, the air went still, so still it felt unnatural. Then, from below, came a sound that froze his blood, the front door creaking open. It was slow, deliberate, dragging wood against warped hinges. He hadn't touched it. No one else was supposed to be here. And yet, something had just stepped inside. Every instinct screamed to flee, to bolt down the stairs and into the night. But he couldn't move. His legs felt rooted, as though the floorboards themselves had curled upward to hold him in place. He tried to breathe, but the air was thick, resisting him. Below, the sound of footsteps drifted up the stairs, measured, heavy, and impossibly patient. Whatever had entered the house wasn't rushing. It knew exactly where he was. The footsteps grew heavier, each one deliberate, groaning the staircase under its weight. He held his phone high, its light trembling across the railing. For a moment, all he saw were warped banisters and peeling wallpaper. Then, a shadow moved where the light should have caught nothing. It stretched unnaturally along the wall, long and crooked, climbing with the sound of something dragging itself upward. His throat tightened, bile rising as the air turned colder still. He whispered to himself, "It's not real, it's not real." But the house disagreed. The sound reached the middle of the stairs. His phone light flickered, catching a glimpse of something that made his skin crawl. A hand, if it could be called that, gripped the railing. The fingers were too long, the joints bent in ways they shouldn't, the nails dark and sharp like splinters. The hand tightened against the wood, leaving shallow gouges as it pulled something heavier upward. He could hear its breathing now, a deep, rattling draw that shook in his own chest. But he couldn't see its face. Every time he tried, the light sputtered as if the house itself refused to reveal too much. Panic surged through him. He backed away, his shoulder slamming against the wall, his free hand clawing for anything, any escape. His eyes darted to the ajar bedroom. It felt like a trap, but it was the only place to hide. The locked second door rattled again, louder now, as if whatever was inside had sensed him faltering. For a moment, he thought of throwing himself through the window at the far end of the hall, but the glass was thick with grime, barred with warped wood. He was cornered, with only choices that led deeper into the house. The thing reached the top step. He heard the slow scrape of its foot dragging across the landing, the sound like wood splintering beneath its weight. He raised the phone, his pulse hammering in his ears, and the light caught its outline, tall, hunched, its limbs bending the wrong way, its face a smear of shadow that shifted when he tried to focus. The doll's chair in the third room scraped suddenly across the floor, moving on its own as though pulled into the hall to watch. His scream caught in his throat, swallowed by the thick air. Desperation broke him free. He lunged into the open bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. Dust exploded into the air as the room shuddered, the walls vibrating faintly as though the house resented his escape. He pressed his weight against the door, every muscle trembling, his phone clutched tight in one hand. On the other side, the landing creaked under slow, dragging steps. The thing was outside. Waiting. Listening. And it had all the time in the world. He pressed his back against the door, chest heaving as he tried to quiet his breaths. Dust swirled in the thin beam of his phone light, drifting like ash in the stagnant air. The footsteps outside slowed, pacing the landing with patient, deliberate rhythm. Each creak of the floorboards felt like a countdown. But worse than the sound was the silence that followed, when the steps stopped altogether, leaving him straining to hear the faintest shift. The creature was out there. Waiting, forcing himself to turn, he swept the phone light across the bedroom. The walls were scrawled with more scratches, though these weren't names or symbols, they were drawings. Crude, childlike sketches of people with hollow circles for eyes, stick-thin bodies, and jagged mouths. The figures crowded every inch of plaster, overlapping, pressed together as though clawing to escape the walls themselves. At the center of the floor lay a small bed frame, its mattress sunken, blankets rotted through. Something was curled on top of it, shrouded beneath a filthy sheet. His throat tightened. He knew better than to touch it, but curiosity and dread dragged him closer. With trembling fingers, he pinched the corner of the sheet and pulled. The fabric peeled away with a damp sound, releasing a stench of mold and iron. Beneath it lay another doll, larger still, its porcelain face cracked across the mouth. Its chest had been crudely carved open, hollow, stuffed with yellowed paper that spilled out like organs. He leaned closer, fighting nausea, and saw writing on the paper, fragmented sentences, desperate pleas, and his name scrawled again and again in frantic hands. The bed frame shuddered suddenly, rattling against the floorboards. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the phone. The doll's glassy eyes rolled in their sockets to meet his. Its cracked mouth widened with a groan of breaking porcelain, opening into a jagged grin. From beneath the bed, fingers shot out, thin, gray, splintered, clawing toward his ankles. He screamed, kicking free, the phone light swinging wildly across the walls. For a moment, the drawing seemed to ripple, the eyeless figures shifting, turning their hollow circles to watch him. Behind him, the bedroom door rattled violently, as though the thing outside had grown impatient. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the walls groaned with strain. He was trapped, the creature at the door, the crawling hands beneath the bed, the painted figures watching from every angle. His phone buzzed with a sudden vibration in his hand. He glanced down, and froze. The screen lit with a notification he hadn't expected, words that chilled him more than anything else. "Welcome back. We've been waiting." His phone slipped from his trembling hand, clattering to the floor. The glow cast eerie shadows up the walls, making the sketched figures writhe in the dim light. The message still burned across the screen, the words etched in his mind like a curse. He staggered backward until his shoulders hit the cold plaster. The door rattled harder now, hinges groaning as though the thing outside was testing the frame. At the same time, the bed frame creaked, the doll twitching as the gray fingers stretched further from beneath. It wasn't just one set of hands now, it was many. A sudden rush of whispers filled the room, swelling from every direction at once. They weren't random this time. They were chanting, a word repeated in overlapping voices, low and guttural. His name. Over and over, louder and louder, until the sound drilled into his skull. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices only grew, vibrating through the walls, through the floorboards, through his bones. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted him, the phone light flickered and changed. On the cracked screen, the wallpaper had shifted to an image, a grainy photo of him standing in the very hallway outside, taken from an angle he didn't remember. His stomach dropped. Another photo appeared, this one of him in the bedroom seconds ago, staring down at the doll. Then another, him at the front door earlier that night, flashlight in hand. The house had been watching him long before he realized it. Maybe long before he even arrived. The doorframe finally split with a sharp crack. He whirled just in time to see a hand slip through the opening, those splintered fingers stretching wide to pry it further. The chanting voices rose into a frenzy, the walls shuddering with the force of their hunger. The doll on the bed sat up with a violent jerk, its hollow chest spilling paper onto the floor. Each sheet unfolded and slid toward him, the writing shifting, morphing into more names, dozens, hundreds, all scratched out violently until only his remained, written bold across the last page. His legs gave out, dropping him to his knees as the room closed in. The drawings on the walls stretched, their eyeless figures peeling from the plaster, their limbs reaching into 3 dimensions. He clawed backward, gasping for air, but there was nowhere left to run. The house wasn't just keeping him, it was claiming him, the way it had claimed so many before. And as the thing on the other side of the door finally shoved its way through, he understood, he had never been exploring the house. He had been invited. The door burst inward with a thunderous crack, shards of wood spraying across the floor. The thing that entered didn't crawl, it poured, its limbs folding and unfolding like broken scaffolding, its shadowed face warping as though it wore every expression at once. The chanting crescendoed, rattling the walls until dust rained down in choking clouds. He scrambled backward, but the eyeless figures peeling from the plaster closed in, their claw-like hands reaching for his arms, his legs, his throat. In a surge of primal terror, he lunged for the window. His phone's dim glow caught on the warped boards nailed across the glass. He slammed his shoulder into them once, twice, until the rotten wood splintered. The hands clawing at him grew stronger, pulling, tearing, but adrenaline shoved him through. Glass shattered, slicing his skin as he tumbled out into the night. He hit the overgrown grass hard, rolling until the breath tore from his lungs. For a moment, silence fell again, real silence, the kind of quiet that belonged to the world outside. He staggered to his feet, his arms bleeding, glass embedded in his palms. The house loomed above, its windows dark, its roofline crooked against the starless sky. But even in the distance, he swore it leaned forward, watching. His chest heaved as he sprinted to the car, every step fueled by the certainty that if he looked back again, he wouldn't make it. He fumbled the keys into the ignition, the engine stalling twice before roaring to life. Gravel spat beneath the tires as he tore down the road, never daring to slow. Only when the house shrank in the rearview mirror did he finally let himself breathe. His hands shook against the wheel, sweat burning his cuts. He wanted to believe it was over, that he had escaped. But then, from the passenger seat beside him, came a sound. Soft. Familiar. A faint creak of wood. He turned his head slowly, heart slamming against his ribs. There, resting neatly on the seat, sat the porcelain doll from the bedroom. Its cracked grin stretched wide, its cloudy eyes fixed on him. The car swerved violently as he screamed, headlights cutting wild arcs across the empty road. In that instant, he realized the house had never been left behind. It had come with him, riding inside his skin, his car, his mind. And no matter how far he ran, he wasn't escaping. He was delivering it.